Okay. Yep. So are we gonna do a practice now, or what's the?
Cameron is, I think she's about to hop on
Oh,
and
okay,
put
great.
the slides.
Perfect. And she has the updated slides, right?
Yes.
Oh, right. I see she sent them. Okay. Wonderful. I just see it now. I just got in.
It says the host has stopped my video.
So she had to give me
Hello,
permission too. I
yeah.
had the same thing. Hey, Mickey.
Hey,
Are you in the office?
no, I'm not.
Okay. Yeah. I wasn't gonna make it back. I had a doctor's appointment, so.
Layla, can you give me permission to
Yeah,
be on?
I did.
Oh.
Right.
There we go.
There you are.
There I am.
All right. So we were just gonna just do a little practice, just
Yeah,
start.
let me hold on. I just want to close everything else on my computer at the moment
I hear you on that.
so that like nothing's bothering and
Do not
dinging and
disturb.
um oh my God, I have so many things open.
I hear you.
This is crazy. Hold on. I need that. I don't need that. Okay, PowerPoint. I'm going to put this over here. And okay, I'm going to share that. And I'm going to put it in presentation mode so that I can see my notes. But it's not working. There we go.
And now I'm going to request remote control.
And I will approve.
Okay. All right. So the only thing I'm realizing is the notes of what I say, are they in like the notes of the original slides? Like if I open this on my end, can I see the notes?
Yes. Did you send me your descriptions, Cameron, or did you put them in yourself?
Your bios, guys. I didn't see
Oh,
anything.
shoot.
Oh,
I
yeah.
completely forgot.
Yeah, I meant to ask you. So do you guys want to shoot those out to me now that you have a minute?
Yeah.
Yes, but I need to get out of this screen for a second. Is that
Okay.
okay?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
All right,
I'm gonna
sorry.
give up remote control and then I'll request it again.
Okay.
Do I need to get like give it
No,
up?
you're
also?
good. No,
Okay.
you're good. You're good. I just need to
Because I want to be able to like at least introduce you guys before I just say like it's my people.
yeah.
Them, they're the
But
best.
Robin, if you could
Yeah.
keep it to 5 minutes, that would be great because I'm like cutting it close.
I'm not going to be 5 minutes.
Okay.
I mean, I'm really just going to go through what's here, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
I don't have any.
I'm just kidding, but like I
Oh,
went
okay,
through
well,
mine this morning and I'm like
I got it.
on the
Yeah.
timing that I thought.
Don't like I talk fast. I think you know that. And I mean, you saw me present. Like I'll take up
You're
less.
fabulous. You're like the best presenter. You're so like eloquent.
Oh, it's very nice to say, but I don't think I will. I mean, I'm not going to I am not going to add anything. Like I'm just going to.
Do you want me just to send this to
not
you
this.
in email? How do you want me to send it?
Oh, however you can send however you want. I'm just gonna if you guys just send it to me, I'll just print it out or I'll pull it up on the screen. But I just want to be able to like say I just need a brief bio, so I can just introduce you guys. Can Mickey, are you sending it also?
Yep, I'm just about to send it. We're talking like 2 or 3
I'm talking like
sentences,
2
right?
Yeah,
sentences.
basically. Yeah, I mean, again, it's not like you guys are going to speak for yourselves. However, I mean, in Cameron's case, I think it's important to say your role. Why are you guys doing this, basically, but also who you are, like a little bit about each of you that justifies like why you guys are experts here. But I will not. Yeah, I mean, everybody is here to hear what you guys have to say, and I don't have anything to contribute to that, except I could say that I made it happen. I hassled you and harassed you, but nobody's going to care about that except for me. So,
do you want to?
I always forget we're methods, analytics, and data science, right?
Methods, analytics, and data science.
That's what it is now.
Yeah.
All right. So you guys getting this to me?
Yeah. just,
The only thing I want to just practice is being able to like, just move things forward. Ideally, I wanted to get my lunch together so I can eat, but I can do that when you guys
Understood.
are talking.
I just sent mine, Robin.
Okay. I had it was earlier, it was like a slow process. Okay, bye. I got yours, Mickey. All right. Mickey is the Vice President of Data Science and Innovation at SSRS, a member of the Methods, Analytics, and Data Science team. He leads methodological research and development across the company and serves as the lead methodologist for the SSRS probability panel. But are you also on this committee, or are you just doing this with Cameron?
And he is
Oh,
a member
true,
of
yeah.
standards and standard definitions.
Right, that Mickey, so I
Let's
just
say
want
that.
to,
So
let me just get this. I don't know if you want to add it or if you want me to just like take this from you, because I want to say, because I feel like it's relevant, your bio is relevant, but having this piece of it.
Yeah.
Okay, so what else do I say? So he leads okay, then what? Mickey,
I'll send you a mod. So it's just like he's a member of the standard definition subcommittee of the standards committee, right?
member of the standard definition subcommittee of the AAPOR standards committee. Because that's really why you're doing this, right?
Presumably.
All right, so Cameron, are you sending me yours? So I'll pop them both in here and then I'll print this out.
putting it in to chat right this second.
Oh, you're putting it in the chat? Okay.
Or do you want me to email it?
Yeah, just email it.
Okay. Done.
Right. I mean, Mickey, you're a member of the AAPOR standards committee too, right? But it's like
He
you're
is, but it's
right.
the standard.
But it's the
he
standards
is.
committee. Okay, got it. Got it.
I actually didn't put standard definitions on mine because as
You're head of
standards
the
chair,
standards committee, right? So I
as
feel like
standards
that's
chair, I'm not technically a sitting member of the sub. I can't be on the subcommittee as standards
matter.
chair.
Right. I don't need, I just, like I
Right.
said, let's just get this from you and then I can pop this in here. I agree. Like, I think you're here because that's,
Right.
because you're that's
Yeah.
your role, right?
Yeah.
So,
I'm
okay.
gonna try this again because I want to be able to see.
Okay. Mickey Jackson.
I just want to see something. Does it come up? Yeah. Okay.
Okay. All right. So Cameron Murphy is the chief methodologist at SSRS, provides, is the chief, okay, she provides,
Sorry.
no, it's okay. She provides methodological and statistical support throughout the organization. And Cameron is here today in her role as the AAPOR standards chair, the past president. She's also she is also past president. Okay. Mickey Jackson is he is a member of the and Mickey is here today. Mickey is here today in his role as
I would say as one of the lead authors of
As
the
one-
updated
as
standard definitions
what-
report.
as a member of the standard definitions committee of the and one of the lead authors
Yeah, of the new
and
of the
one
new.
of the lead authors. Yeah,
Yes, Mickey wrote a big
author.
piece
Sorry, I
of this.
can't type. Authors of the new standards definitions.
The new AAPOR standard definitions,
The new
which we
AAPOR.
are talking about in great
Right,
detail.
standard definitions. Okay, so that's that's the bulk of what I'm going to say. I'm just going to print this out so I have this. I'm pretty confident I will be, as I said, like under 5 minutes, but it really, but you should allow for 5 minutes just in the
Right,
sense that
because I figure
sometimes it
people.
starts a minute or two late, right?
Right.
So then, okay,
I've allowed for 5 minutes intro, and then I start, and then
But it's
we're
not
gonna
letting me-
go. Hopefully,
just-
45.
All right, I'm requesting remote control again because I guess I lost it when you did your thing.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I just want to make sure I can.
And can you move it? And I want to make sure you can move it. I want to make sure Mickey can move it.
Yeah, one sec.
All right, it's not so far. It's
Oh,
not.
you're not
letting
gonna be able
me-
to see my nerdy pie earrings.
It's not
Oh,
letting me
yeah.
move it. I don't know why.
Ah, wait.
Oh,
I
is
need
it-
to. Who's?
I'm
somebody's moving
supposed
it.
to be. Let me just
Okay.
try to.
You do
But
it,
is it
Robin.
just-
You do it now.
It's just like it's either not moving or
Probably
it's very slow. I keep pressing it. So you know what? Maybe I just need to,
I'm gonna wait. Hold on. I'm gonna actually, Mickey. I'm gonna stop. Can you stop remote control, Mickey?
Yeah. Give up remote control. There we go.
Okay, do it again, Robin. Request remote control if you don't already
okay.
have it.
Yeah, I'm gonna request remote control.
I think only one
it's-
person can have it.
Okay, so do I have it
Okay.
now?
Yes. So now you
Okay, it
should
says
be
I
able.
can control it. Is it I'm controlling whatever I'm controlling? Okay. It's still not. You know what? I'll tell you what.
It
Just
says
to make it
waiting for
easier,
Robin Rappaport to control your screen.
it says I can control it, but it's not like responding. What if I try? I'm trying multiple things to move.
If you push the down button,
Let's try that. I've tried like the forward button, the down button. Nothing's moving it.
what about clicking on it with your mouse?
I can't, there's nothing I can click on.
Oh,
Oh,
you
wait,
did
wait,
something.
wait. Oh, okay. All right, maybe
Oh.
that's what it was. Okay, let me try it again. Okay. All right, wait. First of all, is that okay? So the mouse seems to be, but let me go back. Okay, now it's working. All right.
Okay.
So just give me 1 second. I got the things and I can hold on.
Can I test it?
Yeah, test it. Request remote control.
Okay.
All right. So
Hold on,
so
hold on,
basically,
Mickey. Hold on.
okay. Yep.
I'm just gonna do this for Mickey to make sure he can move it,
Yep.
and then you can go through it.
Oh,
Okay, try it again.
Okay.
is it Mickey now or me? Oh, Mickey's doing it.
It's
Okay.
Mickey.
Looks like it's working.
Okay.
So I'll give it up.
But I think it can only be one person. So Robin, take it again. And then
Okay.
you'll keep it until I start.
Now it's not letting me. Do I have to request it again? Okay,
Yeah.
so yours. Okay, I gotta request it again. All right, I requested it. All right, and now. Okay, so I'm just gonna. I guess I'll just say, hey, welcome to what are AAPOR's standard definitions? Calculating AAPOR response rates made easy. So just wanted to let all of you know that before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that AAPOR offers webinar sponsorship opportunities and institutional subscriptions to organizations who would like to support AAPOR's online education program. And if interested, please contact Layla Johnson for future details at ljohnson@aapor.org. Also want to let everybody know that you should please join us for the next webinar in the 2024 series, and that's going to be Poster Design 101, Designing Impactful I hate that word, Designing Impactful Conference Posters, and the presenter is Angelica Phillips, and that's going to be on March 20th, 2024 from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm Robin Rappaport, and I'm here on behalf of the AAPOR Online Subcommittee. And I'm going to ask that you enter your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and that you should please complete the webinar survey immediately following the presentation. And I just wanted to introduce our two presenters. So they are my esteemed colleagues from SSRS, Cameron McPhee, and Cameron McPhee is the Chief Methodologist at SSRS, and she provides methodological and statistical support throughout our organization. She directs the SSRS Advanced Analytics and Data Science team to deliver high-quality, statistically sound solutions developed using experimentally validated methods. And Cameron's here today in her role as the AAPOR Standards Chair, and she's also the past president of DC AAPOR, the chair of the AAPOR Task Force, and the AAPOR Task Force on Online Samples. Is that current? Your past?
Past chair.
And
was the chair.
And was the chair? And was the chair of the AAPOR Task. Okay. And I'm also introducing Mickey Jackson, who is the Vice President of Data Science and Innovation at SSRS and a member of the Methods, Analytics, and Data Science team. He leads methodological research and development across SSRS and serves as the lead methodologist for the SSRS probability panel. And Mickey is here today in his role as a member of the AAPOR Standards Definition Subcommittee of the AAPOR Standards Committee and one of the lead authors of the new AAPOR Standards definitions. So with that, I'm handing it over to you, Cameron.
Right.
All right. So you can still control it though, right?
Yep, I can
Which is what
control
you
it
did.
completely. And
Okay.
then when it's Mickey's turn, like when I get to one slide, I'm gonna say, you know, I'm gonna turn it, when I get here, I'm gonna say, I'm gonna turn it over to Mickey Jackson. I'm now gonna turn
Okay.
this over to Mickey Jackson to start diving into the nitty gritty of the different frame types. And if you want to,
You want to try it now, Mickey? Yeah.
There we go.
cool.
Okay, so we have to go back to the beginning and then I've got a request control. And then we all have like a few minutes before people start joining, right? So we can
Yep.
all stay on this screen, Layla, right? And then I will hide myself once you guys start speaking.
Robin, I have a favor to ask you.
Sure.
If you could just send me a note after the webinar about the attendance.
Yeah, sure. You mean like the
Because-
numbers of people?
That'll be me. I'll do that.
Okay. But I need it right away because I actually need to put it into my consent agenda for tomorrow and I like left
Yeah.
a placeholder for it.
But I'll get it out right away, because I'm gonna be immediately following up with them for the surveys.
Okay.
Right now, our registration total is at 192.
Yeah.
Right,
I
well,
just
okay,
wanna-
so something less than that presumably will come
Right.
because not everybody, some people just want to have access. Okay, Cameron, I'm trying to request control. Do you want to just,
Oh, sorry.
um,
Comes up on the wrong screen.
okay,
There we go.
so I didn't know what you meant by your consent, so I feel like that's
Yeah,
unrelated.
yeah,
to
no,
me.
it's just for my council meeting tomorrow.
Oh.
I put in that we did this webinar, but I wanted to provide a statistic for it. But I
Yeah,
didn't have it because we hadn't done it. But
yeah,
I had to
perfect.
submit my agenda yesterday and then, anyway, I was just gonna
Okay.
update it right after this and then
All
we'll
right.
all be done.
So I am gonna mute and hide myself for a minute,
Yeah,
and then I'll be
me
able
too,
to
I
do
guess.
that. What?
I said I'll mute too.
Yeah, and then come back in a few minutes if that's okay.
Hey, Mickey, when you're looking at the slides, do you see like the Zoom bar on top
Yes.
of the screens? You do?
Oh, what do you mean? No, we just see welcome. We see the full,
You see the slides, but you don't see
just the
the
slide.
Zoom bar that says that waiting for Robin to take control of your, you don't
Well,
see
I
any of
see
that.
you can control Cameron McPhee's screen, but I think that's because we're the panelists. I'm guessing Layla
Okay.
doesn't see that.
Yeah, it doesn't show up in the sharing box.
Okay. Okay, cool. Just making sure.
Yeah, well, whatever it's, yes, because you probably have. All right. 100 people said they're joining. No pressure. You're going to be great.
Are 50 of the 190 just our SSRS colleagues?
You can probably see, I mean, I can see who they are. So can you. But no, so far I am not seeing most of the people I'm seeing in the 30, whatever, 28 people are nobody from SSRS. So far, wow, it's a great crew already. The best and the brightest.
I can't get my video back on. Hold on one second. Hold on. I'm going to do something just for a second.
Layla, we're not live yet, right?
You are live. It's
Okay,
something-
everybody's hearing us chit chat here. Hi, everybody. We're not
Hey,
recording.
No, you're recording. I don't know who hit the start webinar. But
Okay.
yes.
All right. Well, hopefully we only say good things.
Yeah.
All right. All right. We're almost there. Okay. It is 1:01, and in the interest of our very packed webinar, I'm going to get started, and I want to welcome everybody to what are AAPOR standard definitions, calculating AAPOR response rates made easy. Okay, let's try to advance the slides again, and one more time. Can't do it. Okay, there we are. All right, so I am Robin Rappaport, and I am an EVP at SSRS, but I'm here today in my role as co-chair of the AAPOR Online Subcommittee. And we have been planning lots of webinars, and we are offering webinar sponsorship opportunities to organizations that would like to sponsor our AAPOR online education program. And if interested, please contact Layla Johnson for further details at ljohnson@aapor.org. Meanwhile, our next webinar in the series is Poster Design 101, Designing Impactful Conference Posters. And the presenter is going to be Angelica Phillips, and we're going to, that is scheduled for March 20th, 2024, between 1 and 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Okay, and just a little bit of technical information that to please be sure to answer your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And also, please try to complete the webinar survey that comes up immediately after the session. And with that, I just want to introduce my colleagues, my esteemed colleagues, who will be presenting today. So Cameron McPhee is the chief methodologist at SSRS, and she provides methodological and statistical support throughout our organization. She directs the SSRS Advanced Analytics and Data Science team to deliver high-quality, statistically sound solutions developed using experimentally validated methods. Cameron is here today in her role as the AAPOR Standards Chair, and she's also the past president of DC AAPOR and was the chair of the AAPOR Task Force on Online Samples. And she will be presenting along with Mickey Jackson. And Mickey is the Vice President of Data Science and Innovation at SSRS, a member of the Methods Analytic and Data Science team here. He leads methodological research and development across SSRS and serves as the lead methodologist for the SSRS probability panel. And Mickey is here today as a member of the Standards Definition Subcommittee of the AAPOR Standards Committee and one of the lead authors of the new AAPOR Standards Definition. So with that, I'm handing it over to you.
Thanks, Robin. Hi, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here on Valentine's Day. Super excited to be presenting about the new AAPOR standard definitions. I'm sure you're all dying to get started. So before we start, I just want to thank all the folks, both past and present, who were part of the Standard Definitions Committee that worked to get this revision completed. It was actually many years in the making. And I also want to acknowledge the folks who graciously reviewed and edited the document for us, which also includes all of the wonderful AAPOR staff. Given that it's likely that people listening today might have different levels of familiarity with the standard definitions, I'm going to review a few things so that we're all on the same page. So what are we talking about? What are the standard definitions? The standard definitions, it is a document. It is a comprehensive way of describing the final disposition or status of cases that are sampled for a survey from a variety of frames and contacted through a variety of modes and mechanisms. The definitions provide a common language for all of us, for the research community, so that we can sort of understand what we're talking about when we compute outcome rates. And it includes formulas for computing outcome rates in surveys in a systematic way. It facilitates survey researchers in meeting AAPOR's standards for minimal disclosure requirements as outlined by the Code of Professional Ethics. So, you know that if you're following the standard definitions and reporting it according to the standard definitions, you are following the transparency requirements and the reporting requirements of AAPOR. But I think most importantly, the definitions help us understand that knowing the status and disposition of every element in a sample that we've drawn to survey, researchers can really assess whether their sample might contain some non-response error. It indicates the potential reasons for that error. We're not going to get into the pros and cons of using response rates to measure data quality in this. I can refer you to the task force report, but it is an important tool in sort of understanding what's happening with all of your sample cases. The 10th edition of the standard definitions has been pretty dramatically reorganized and revised to better align with how we're conducting survey research these days. The previous definitions had been originally written in the RDD days, and updates were made kind of piecemeal. This revision really centers around the assumption that most of us are doing some kind of mixed mode research. And many of us are not using RDD frames anymore at all. And if so, they tend to only be a portion of the research frames that we're using. The committee felt like the old version didn't sufficiently differentiate between sample frame and the data collection mode, because in the RDD days, they were sort of one and the same. But you'll see as we go through this webinar, the way we assign case dispositions is determined not by the mode that we've used to contact a sampled unit. It's not determined by the mode that they use to complete the survey, but it's really determined by the frame from which the sample was selected. The new report's also done a couple other things. Some things, it's added important information about calculating outcome rates specifically for multi-mode designs. It has a few new and changed subcodes, and it's added some new dispositions and outcome codes specifically related to using SMS methodologies to reach sampled units. But a lot of things haven't changed, right? The 4 main sets of outcome codes have remained the same. So we have completed interviews, eligible cases that are not interviewed, so eligible non-respondents, cases of unknown eligibility, and cases that are not eligible. And we'll come back to these over and over and over again throughout the day. But those were the same, they are the same, they have stayed the same. And the actual formulas for calculating the response rates, the cooperation rates, refusal rates, contact rates, those haven't changed at all. Those are exactly the same, and the buckets that go into those are the same. The committee also did their best whenever possible to maintain the codes and code structure from the previous versions, though some new codes have been added and a few have been changed. Within the actual document and the Excel calculator that's online, any code that's new or revised from a previous version is marked with an asterisk. So for those of you who are very detailed and have systems in place that assign codes to your cases, you can go and look and see which ones have actually changed. To start off today, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about some overarching rules for how we classify the status of sample cases throughout data collection and make sure we're all on the same page about why it's important to think about the sample frame when deciding how to classify sample units. Then we're going to spend some time talking about the 4 main frame types that are outlined in the definitions and for which the response rate calculator provides codes. So that includes list frames, address-based sample frames, random digit dial telephone frames, and samples that are drawn from probability-based online panels. For each frame, we're going to spend some time discussing broadly how we think about the outcome codes and go over some examples that tend to be the most confusing. I'm going to briefly talk about the outcome rate calculations in the context of previous discussion, but I don't plan to spend a lot of time talking about the calculations. As I mentioned, they've not really changed, and they're relatively straightforward once you've correctly classified all your cases. So we're going to focus on sort of the case classification side, but if you have questions at the end, I'm happy to answer them. The definition of completed interviews, right? Like that's the easiest thing. It's consistent across frames. It has not changed over time. I'm going to go over it here rather than within the frame specific sections because they're all the same. So all of these 1 dot something codes, like these are our complete interviews or our partially complete interviews. And for any frame and with any mode, we can consider multiple levels of completion of a survey instrument. So specifically completes and partials. The distinction between completes and partials is the proportion of questions answered by the respondent. This could be based on a respondent answering a specific portion of the items asked. It could be a proportion of the subset of like crucial or key items that you've assigned. It could also be based in the case of a web instrument on the proportion of screens that a respondent has viewed. But regardless of the definition of a partial interview, that definition has to be made in advance. A decision has to be made in advance of data collection about what the criteria is going to be, and that definition needs to be provided in all of the methodological documentation. So as the researcher, you get to decide what a partial is, but you don't get to decide it at the end of the survey. A few other overarching rules to keep in mind. It's often really useful from an operational perspective to keep detailed information about a particular case's status. So for example, distinctions among non-contacts, like whether a respondent was unavailable or an answering machine was reached, or no one was ever present at a housing unit in an in-person study. These specific sub-definitions or sub-dispositions are not required for response rate calculation. So a higher level summary code, in the case of non-contacts, it would be like a 2.2, some kind of code, can be used if surveys want to keep their number of categories simple. This doesn't have to be complicated. AAPOR provides a lot of options for classifying case status, but higher level summary codes are always fine if you want to keep the number of categories limited. The level of detail with which you store your case information is totally up to you, as long as cases are classified correctly into one of the 4 main outcome codes, and as long as you've documented enough information in your coding and in your outcome codes to be able to correctly calculate eligibility rates among cases that you don't know the status of. So we're going to discuss that a little bit more as we go. But for the most part, it can be sort of overwhelming for new people when they look at the standard definitions. They see, layer upon layer upon layer of code. The important codes are the high level codes. The standard definitions and outcome rates are based on the final status codes for any given case. So throughout data collection, it's really common for a case to have multiple temporary status codes. So you might start as an unknown, and then we may reach somebody at a household, but it's not the respondent, and the case may become a non-contact. And then at some point, the respondent might complete the survey or refuse to participate. And the final code should always be based on the code that provides the most information about a case contingent upon the frame from which it was sampled. So we're going to get into that more again. But all of this is talking about a final status code. It's not talking about any intermediary or temporary status code. So in order to use this document and use the calculator, you have to have assigned each case to a final status code. And sometimes researchers will allow some kind of substitution of one sampled unit for another. So in these cases, from the perspective of the standard definitions, it's really important that all substitution rules are documented and that the number and nature of substitutions is reported. All replaced cases must be accounted for in the final dispositions. So if a household refuses, say one household refuses, so you substitute in another household per some substitution method that you're using, and then no one's reached at that initially substituted household, and then an interview is completed at a second substitute household. All three of those cases would be listed as sampled, and all three would have individual disposition codes assigned and go into your final calculation of outcome rate. So that's true across frames and across modes. Finally, if a sample is released in replicates, so perhaps you're releasing sample in batches because you're not sure what your yield is going to be, and you don't want to just dump all your sample out there and then realize you didn't need it all, but you think you might need more sample over time. So you sort of randomly create these replicate samples. All units within a given replicate must be treated as a released sample if any single unit is released, regardless of whether any contact was attempted with that unit. So this happens a lot with RDD and telephone, but it can happen in other frames too. So maybe you have a set of replicate phone numbers that you're sort of keeping in your back pocket in case it turns out you need more to get your target number of completes. Towards the end of data collection, you release this replicate sample of phone numbers, but not all of them can be dialed before the end of data collection. Regardless of whether a case was dialed in this example, once the replicate's released, all the sample units are active and must have appropriate dispositions assigned. So they all are going to be non-respondents or ineligible if you actually know that they're ineligible or whatnot. So that also applies across frames. Lastly, for my portion here, why is sample frame so important? We're very focused in this new document on sample frame. And, as we sadly know in most studies, the majority of sample cases won't complete the survey. So that means we have to make some assumptions about the eligibility of a sampled unit that we don't really know anything about. So often these assumptions are based on information or some prior decision that we've made from the sample frame. So for example, a mail survey that's returned, you might mail a survey to a list sample, and one of your units or multiple units comes back as non-deliverable from the post office. For a list frame, that might indicate some kind of locating issue. You had a bad address on your frame, you couldn't reach the person that you were sampled, and you might classify that case as an eligible non-respondent. But a similar mail piece could come back to you from an address-based sample, and you would likely classify that as a not eligible sample because it's sort of indicating that there is no such housing unit potentially at that address, at that sampled address. So it really depends on the frame, not the mode. That you've done exactly the same thing, you've used exactly the same mode, but the disposition is different depending on the frame. So, the same result can lead to different case statuses depending on the frame, and that's why we're so focused on it. We're going to talk a lot about that throughout the webinar, but a really good rule of thumb, I think, when you're not certain about how to disposition a case is to return to the frame and think, what do I know about this specific unit that I've selected for this study? And now I'm going to turn this over to Mickey, and he's going to start diving into the nitty-gritty of some of our different frame types.
Thanks. Thank you, Cameron. Let me just make sure I can control the slides here. There we go. Hi, everyone. So we're going to talk through the 4 primary types of sampling frames that are covered, that each have their own section of the standard definitions report. And the first frame that we'll talk about, I think, is a good vehicle for introducing some of the intuition here, which is list frames. In some ways, these are kind of the easiest conceptual type of sampling frame because they are just that. A list frame is a list of specific named persons from which you draw a sample. So there are all kinds of examples of this, right? If you're doing a survey of employees at a given company, your frame might be a list of everybody who was employed at the company as of a certain date. Another example of this in a US context is if you're using a registration-based sample drawn from a voter file, that is a listed sample. It's a list of everybody who the state thinks is registered to vote in that state. Now, one thing that's critical here that sort of gets to this distinction between mode and frames is that with listed samples especially, the standards really make no assumptions about what type of contact information you have on your listed frame. Some of these lists might have phone numbers for the people. Some of them might have email addresses, mailing addresses, or some combination thereof. So in this section, you'll see that there are codes associated with all of these different types of modes. But the unifying principle is that the unit that you are sampling and trying to reach is a specific named person or entity. And so what that means is that the determining factor in choosing a disposition code with a listed frame is whether you were able to reach that specific person and whether that person is in fact part of your target population. Now, with a listed frame, a very important decision that you need to make ahead of time is how accurate you think the list is. In other words, whether it is reasonable to assume that someone on your list is eligible as part of your target population solely by virtue of the fact that they are on the list. So if you have a list that you know is accurate and up to date, like a list of employees that you got from the payroll department, you can probably assume that everybody on that list is in your target population, even before you've gotten in touch with them. But then there are other types of lists where you might not be able to make that assumption, where you have to do some screening to make sure that somebody on that list is actually still in your target population. So a good example of this would be if you're sampling from a voter file, right? I mean, we know that there are lags in states updating of their voter files. So if you reach somebody from a voter file sample, you might find that they're no longer a registered voter in the state that you're trying to sample. So that's a situation where you would have to do some screening in a listed sample. And so that assumption about how accurate your list is and whether you need to do any screening is going to play a big role in determining whether somebody goes into the eligible non-response category or the unknown eligibility category. So now we'll start talking about some specific dispositions. So for each of these frames, we're basically going to spend all our time talking about the 3 different types of non-response. As Cameron noted, the rules for defining completes are the same across frames, so we're not going to repeat them here. And, there are obviously too many specific codes to go through each one individually. So what we're going to try to do for each frame is just talk through kind of the general principles to follow when deciding what family of codes is most appropriate for a given case. So for all of the frames that we're going to cover, the codes that start with a 2 are for eligible non-responses. These are cases that, for whatever reason, are not a complete. They didn't complete enough items to be a complete or a partial. But you have enough information to determine that they are in fact part of your target population. They are eligible. Now across frames for eligible non-responses, we have this common structure where the 2.1 codes are for refusals and breakoffs, the 2.2 codes are for non-contacts, and then there are 2.3 codes that cover some miscellaneous situations. Now, in a listed sample, in choosing whether to use these eligible non-response codes, this is where your assumptions about the quality of the list become really critical. So on the one hand, if you can assume that your list that you're sampling from is up to date and accurate, and you don't have to do any further screening, then you should expect that most of your non-responses are going to fall under one of these eligible non-response codes. On the other hand, if you do have to screen to confirm eligibility, then you would only use these eligible non-response codes if you get enough information to confirm that the unit is eligible. So I'll use breakoffs as an example. This is kind of an easy example of this. So if somebody starts the survey but then breaks off, if you're able to assume that everybody on the list is eligible, then it doesn't matter so much where they broke off on the survey. That, you know, your breakoffs would pretty much all be classified under the appropriate 2.1 subcode. On the other hand, if you do need to do some screening, then you need to take into consideration where they broke off. So if somebody completed the screener and then broke off during the main interview, at that point, you know that they're eligible for your survey, so you would use one of the subcodes of 2.1. But if they broke off before they finished the screener and didn't give you enough information to determine whether they're eligible, then you would probably use one of the unknown eligibility codes. So let's move on to the 3 codes which cover cases of unknown eligibility. So these codes are appropriate when a unit was not a complete for whatever reason, and you do not know whether they were in your target population. So if your survey requires screening to confirm eligibility, then across frames, really, someone who doesn't get through the screener is very likely going to be coded into one of the subcodes under 3.2. Now, for listed frames in particular, there are lots of subcodes under 3.2 that denote various reasons why somebody would not have completed the screener. For a listed sample, this is going to include a lot of the return mail codes that you would get from the post office if you make contact via mail. If you're using emails, a lot of the email undeliverable codes fall under 3.2 here. And if you're trying to reach somebody by phone in a listed sample, a lot of phone non-response codes are going to fall under 3.2, like busy signal, bad number, and so forth. So again, you'd use these codes if you need a screener and somebody doesn't complete it. If you don't need a screener, then one of the non-contact codes under eligible non-response is probably more appropriate. Now, one thing you might notice if you look at the table of dispositions for listed samples is that there are no codes under the 3.1 block for listed samples. 3.1 codes are reserved for other frames where you're trying to reach some proxy for a household and you don't know yet whether you've reached a residence. So you'll see 3.1 codes come up in other frames, but they're not applicable in a list frame because in a list frame, you are directly sampling a specific person. So finally, the last category of disposition codes is ineligible. So ineligible codes will always start with a 4. Ineligible codes are appropriate if you have been able to somehow confirm that the unit you sampled is not actually eligible for your survey. In other words, is not part of the population that you're trying to survey. So for a lot of listed samples, as long as the list is reasonably accurate, ineligibles are probably going to be relatively rare compared to some of the other frames we'll talk about. But there are some instances where this might come up. So for example, in a listed sample, if you reach somebody off your listed sample and you find that they passed away before the survey was fielded, depending on the date as of which you're establishing eligibility, that might make the proper disposition of the case ineligible. Another instance where ineligibles sometimes come up is if you're using quotas for particular subgroups. Quota failures might be ineligible, but might not be. This is an area where there's a little bit of nuance, and I think where the current edition of the standards, of the standard definitions, has changed a little from the last edition. So quota failures can be ineligible under certain circumstances, but there are other circumstances where they might be more properly classified as eligible non-responses. So if you're running a survey that uses quotas for particular subgroups, I would strongly encourage you to take a look at the text of the standards for a discussion of different scenarios where these might be eligible non-responses versus ineligibles. So that rounds out listed samples. So we'll now move into the second frame that has its own section in the definitions. And this is where things start to get a little bit more complex. And this is address-based sampling frames. Now, for the purpose of the definitions, An address-based sampling frame means any frame that is fundamentally a list of addresses, as opposed to a list of specific named persons or named entities. So for those who do research in the US, the example of this that many of us are most likely to encounter is the computerized delivery sequence file that is maintained from the post office and licensed by various vendors. But there are a couple of other types of frames that would qualify as address-based for the purpose of these definitions. The distinguishing feature of the ABS is that you are not sampling a person, you are sampling a physical address and trying to reach the people, whoever happens to live at that address. So with that in mind, the overarching principle and kind of the one takeaway that I think is important to have from this part of the webinar is that in an ABS sample, when you're trying to determine whether to use an eligible non-response code, an unknown eligibility code, or an ineligible code, the defining principle needs to be what you learn about the physical address that you sampled. So this is a nuance that will become important when we talk about some of the secondary contact modes that you might use with an ABS. Now, since we are sampling addresses and not specific people in an address-based frame, usually we will need to do some kind of screening to confirm whether there's at least one eligible person living at the address. Now, the way the codes are organized, they assume that you are doing this as a single phase survey. In other words, the assumption is that your screening questions and then your main interview questions are done as part of the same questionnaire and you assign a single disposition code. So when that's the case, because we're usually going to be screening, you need to be careful in distinguishing between eligible non-respondents and cases of unknown eligibility. You need to consider whether you've learned enough about the address to determine whether there's at least one person in your target population at the address. Now, I'll briefly mention that there is an alternative approach here, which is somewhat common in ABS type designs, which is to do it as a two-phase survey. So that's where you split the screening, you treat the screening phase and then the main interview as essentially separate questionnaires with separate disposition codes. The report, if you're using this type of approach, the report has a much more detailed discussion about how dispositions should be assigned in that case. But the general principle is for a two-phase survey, you'd use the ABS standards for phase 1 and then the standards for a listed sample for phase 2. Now with ABS, because you are sampling from a list of addresses, the primary contact mode is almost always going to be either mail or in person. However, it is possible to use other modes in ABS as a secondary contact mode. So you'll see in the ABS standards that, again, there are codes not just for mailings and in-person contacts, but also codes for phone contacts and even email contacts. Now, with an ABS sample, because your sampled unit is a physical address, in order to use phone numbers or emails to try to reach people, you have to do a match of a phone number or an email address to the physical address that you sampled. And most ABS frame vendors do have, some sort of proprietary matching procedure that lets them find phone numbers that are likely associated with addresses. However, any vendor will tell you that this process does involve error. What that means is that what you learn about, for example, a phone number that you matched to an address doesn't necessarily tell you anything about the address itself. So there are two implications there. First of all, if you reach somebody by a secondary piece of contact information that was appended to the address, your screening should include some confirmation that the person you reach actually lives at the address that you sampled. Secondly, if you reach somebody who doesn't live at your sampled address, or if you don't reach anybody, very likely the case would be dispositioned as unknown eligibility. So particularly in the case of phone, there are lots of dispositions that you might be familiar with from the RDD world that would be considered ineligible in an RDD frame, but are more properly classified as unknown eligibility in an ABS frame. If you get a non-working number that was matched to an address, that doesn't actually tell you anything about the address. It tells you that, a bad phone number was matched to the address, but it doesn't tell you whether the address itself is eligible. So very likely you'd use an unknown eligibility code there. So because of these types of considerations, eligible non-respondents tend to be pretty rare in ABS samples. In order to use one of the codes under the 2 block, you need to have first confirmed that the sampled address exists, is occupied, and includes at least one eligible person. So again, the break-off example would also be relevant here, right? In an ABS sample, if somebody breaks off after finishing the screener, then probably you'd use one of the break-off codes under 2.1. If they break off before you've been able to determine eligibility, an unknown eligibility code is likely going to be more appropriate. And so conversely, with ABS, unknown eligibility is likely to be much more common than eligible non-response. So as I sort of alluded to earlier, with ABS, the unknown eligibility codes are organized into 2 broad categories. So we've got the 3.1 block, which is for situations where you do not know whether the address that you sampled is occupied and residential. That includes the very common situation, by the way, where you mail something out to the address and then never hear anything back. The 3.2 block is for situations where you have confirmed that the address exists and is occupied, but haven't yet confirmed whether it includes anybody in your target population. So again, this is for situations where, for whatever reason, you've been able to confirm that the address exists, but the screener wasn't completed either in whole or in part. And again, unknown eligibility is where you'll see a lot of phone codes that you would use if you're dialing a phone number that was matched to an ABS sample, reflecting the point I made previously about using matched contact information. Finally, really quickly, here's a summary of the ineligible codes, the 4 codes that are associated with ABS samples. So with ABS, there are sort of 2 broad categories of ineligibility that are likely to be most common. The codes that are in the top block of this slide correspond to various situations where the address itself is not eligible, meaning the address that you sampled doesn't actually exist, is not occupied at the time of your survey, or is non-residential. The second set of codes is for instances where the address exists and is a valid residential address, but doesn't include anybody in your target population based on your screening. Now, as we'll talk about briefly at the end, often you'll want to calculate separate eligibility rates for housing unit eligibility and individual eligibility. So the codes in the top block would enter into your housing unit eligibility calculation, and the remaining codes would be part of your individual ineligibility calculation. The other thing you'll see if you look at the standards is that most of the most common in an ABS sample, unlike in a listed sample, most of the most common post office undeliverable codes that you will see would classify the address as ineligible. So, you know, if you get a return mail back saying the address doesn't exist or is vacant, that's an ineligible. But there are a couple of caveats about this. One, if you get a piece of return mail, but then you get some other information suggesting that the address is actually eligible, very likely the eligible non-response code would be the disposition that you would use because it gives you more information than the USPS return code. The other caveat here, specifically with vacant addresses, is that there is a flag on the computerized delivery sequence file that indicates addresses that the post office thinks is vacant, but that flag is not always accurate or up to date. So the vacant disposition under ineligible should only be used if you actually get a piece of return mail indicating that the address is vacant. You shouldn't disposition addresses as vacant based solely on the vacant flag on the delivery sequence file. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cameron, who will talk about our last 2 frames, RDD and prob panels.
Thanks, Mickey. Yeah, I left the hard stuff to him. So I'm going to talk a little bit about RDD frames. While, you know, they're not as common as they used to be, they are still used, and they're often used in conjunction with some other type of frame. So what is an RDD frame? So we're all on the same page, right? For those youngins who don't know. This is a set of randomly selected phone numbers. It can be done in several different ways. RDD comes from the notion that you actually literally just sort of compiled numbers together within some known set of like area codes. But really it's a list of phone numbers or can be conceptualized as a list of phone numbers that will either reach a person or a household. It's common nowadays to use dual frame RDD. So you'll see DF-RDD, where two samples are drawn, one from a landline and one from a cell phone frame. Like ABS designs, RDD phone numbers eligibility can be decomposed into sort of two main sections. Is the phone number itself eligible? Is it working, and does it belong to an individual who lives in a household? And is the person that is contacted via that phone number eligible, or, you know, conversely, is the phone number used by at least one person that is within the study's target population? RDD frames can be seen, typically landline frames are assumed to be sort of household based, similar to the address, similar to an ABS, and should be treated as a contact that could potentially reach multiple individuals. Cell phone frames are primarily individual devices in the US, and researchers have found sort of a within household selection among cell phone frames and cell phone samples is not necessary. Dual frame RDD samples really should be treated as two separate frames for the purpose of computing the response rates and dispositioning cases. So you'll have dispositions from your landline sample, you'll have dispositions from your cell sample, you'll create outcome rates for each, and then an overall rate can be calculated as a weighted average between the two. This is detailed in the standard definitions and actually has not changed really since the last version of the standard definitions, but I'm including it here. It's also really sort of recommended that if you do have multiple phone frames or a cell phone frame and a landline frame, that you report your rate separately along with an overall or combined rate, so that people really understand the effectiveness and outcome status of both samples separately. Okay, so I'm going to go through this. Eligible non-respondents in RDD frames, right? For a code to be classified as a 2-point anything, the number must have been confirmed to be associated with an occupied residence. So in the case of a landline, it has to be associated with a residence. In the case of a cell phone, with a person who lives in a household. If that is not established, then you will not be using a 2.0 code for that particular case. As Mickey talked about, if any further screening for eligibility is going to be required, you're trying to reach parents of children, you're trying to reach people who fish, you're trying to reach any number of eligibility criteria. The confirmation that the phone number is associated with at least one eligible person has to be determined in order to use a 2-point something frame code. So this is very similar to ABS. 2.1 codes are used when some contact has been made with the individuals associated with the phone number and they refuse to participate or they break off, and we've determined that they're eligible. So they've done whatever screening is required, or perhaps no screening is required, but we know we've reached a household and we've determined it, but they're like, no, thank you, I really don't want to take this survey, and they hang up, and then they can be coded as an eligible non-respondent. 2.2 codes are used when the household or phone is confirmed eligible, but a particular respondent is selected and screened in, but never available to participate. So this happens when appointments are set, but you've confirmed some sort of household eligibility, or you've reached somebody and they keep putting you off, or they've completed part of it and you haven't been, but not enough to be a complete. And you've sort of tried to get back into contact with them and they haven't finished completing the study. Or you might have dialed a number and received a voicemail message that's like, you've reached John Smith, please leave a message. And if there's no other eligibility criteria, you've sort of established that you've reached a person, but you haven't been able to get in touch with them. 2.3 codes or some other form of non-response where eligibility has also been determined. It's not a super common code, but it comes up in the context of RDD often if you're calling a cell phone and the sampled cell phone that you've reached is a person that says that they're driving, because often that's a safety issue and you've screened and you've said, are you driving? Can you talk now? And they say no, and you terminate the call. And if no additional screening is required or you've already determined eligibility, you might use a 2.3 code for that. Unknown eligibility for RDD, like ABS frames, it occurs because either there's insufficient information to determine if the phone number is associated with a housing unit, and then you've given them some kind of 3.1 codes, or there's sufficient information to determine that the phone number is associated with a housing unit or an individual, but insufficient information to determine whether the housing unit or individual is eligible. 3.2 codes. So you can see the parallel with the ABS, but now the sampled unit is the phone number. So what we're trying to identify is what information we have about the phone number to determine whether it is eligible for our study and within the target population. You might see 3.1 codes also included for cases where the phone number is in a released replicate but never dialed. So I talked about that at the beginning. You would put a code into you would put a phone number that's not dialed into an unknown eligibility. It's in a released replicate. It has been sampled, but you haven't dialed it, so you don't know anything about that unit. And then as we talk about response rate calculations, you're going to see that you're going to assume some portion of that set is ineligible, but you don't know what that portion is yet. 3.2 codes are typically included when when no screener was completed. Interestingly, with RDD, there are specific situations like encountering an answering machine that could lead to different subcodes if there's not sufficient information to determine if the number is associated with an individual residence, or if it's not clear that the individual meets the screening criteria. But again, these are all sort of subcodes of unknown eligibility, which can be used to calculate your unknown eligibility rate, but you don't need to go down to a 3 or 4 level code in order to appropriately calculate response rates. Ineligibility for a sampled unit is much more common in RDD than in ABS because we do typically get some information back about the phone when we dial it. And especially in the old days of true RDD, you were often dialing numbers that were not real numbers, that were not assigned to any household or individual. And you learned that and you were able to disposition them as ineligible. So, a 4.1 is that a selected respondent screened out and was ineligible. So that's households outside the sampling area. Typically, they screened out as out of sample. So oftentimes, if you're doing a geographically defined area with phone these days, people move, people can transport their phone numbers. You might be doing a sample of Philadelphia residents, and you're likely to reach people who are outside of Philadelphia. They would get a 4.1 code. The 4.2 through 4.4 are mostly the sort of technologically driven codes in terms of bad numbers, but there are a bunch of different ways of classifying bad numbers. You also might end up with numbers that are out of scope because you've reached a business. You thought it was a residential phone number, but in fact, it's a business, or it's a group quarters who are out of scope of your population. Or maybe they've completed a screener and there's no eligible respondent associated with the phone number. Typical, very standard 4.7. And then 4.8 codes can often be assigned when you've assigned a replicate and they just have never been released, or duplicate numbers. All right, lastly, I want to briefly talk about samples drawn from probability-based online panels. These are panels of individuals that have agreed to take surveys, typically maintained by a vendor, and have been recruited using a probability-based method. These days, that's often ABS. Typically, a researcher contracts with a vendor to send survey invitations to some portion of panelists. And often it's a subsample of the full panel, but there are cases, Hughes American Trends panel is a good example where often the full panel is invited to a study, but commonly if you're contracting with a panel vendor, they're going to sample from their panel some subset of cases and invite them to your study. And in the case of panels, you have to deal with non-response at 2 main stages, right? Recruitment into the panel, and then invitation and response to a particular survey. So in practice, there's a number of additional steps involved in recruiting and maintaining online panels that could factor into other cooperation rates that you have to account for, but primarily we think of recruitment and study level response. What's important for these samples is that the disposition codes and outcome rates should be recorded and calculated for both stages. How the cases are coded will be based on which phase they're being computed for. So for instance, recruitment rates often follow the ABS outcome codes that Mickey talked about, because that's the recruitment, that was the frame used for the initial recruitment into the panel. So that the recruitment rates should be treated as an ABS frame. Survey level completion rates, once a person has been impaneled, really constitute a list of named individuals, right? You've had somebody, they've agreed to participate. Now you have a list frame, which is your panel. And so your outcome codes associated with response to your survey invitation are going to be treated the way that you would treat a listed sample. In practice, these rates are typically computed and provided by the company that maintains the panel, but it's really important as researchers to always make sure your study documentation includes both recruitment and study level response rates, as well as an overall combined response rate when using sample from probability online panels. You should always ask your panel vendor to provide all relevant outcome rates. So this could, in addition to the recruitment and study level response rates, vendors might provide you profile rates, attrition rates, other forms of cooperation rates. And that's really important to ensure transparency. And most of the main probability panels, I would say, are very, really have a good grasp on this and are able to provide those rates. I want to highlight with asterisks, right? All of this discussion and calculation of outcome rates is really only appropriate for panels that use probability-based methods for recruitment, and they shouldn't be calculated for opt-in or non-probability samples. For more details, I will refer you to the AAPOR task force on data quality metrics for online samples, which Mickey and I both were part of. But again, like this whole document is really assumes a probability-based sample, and it's important to keep that in mind. Okay, I'm going to briefly talk about outcome rates because I want to make sure that we have time for questions. I think that, questions are super important here. AAPOR standard definitions provides formulas for calculating 4 sets of outcome rates: response rates, cooperation rates, refusal rates, and contact rates. I'm going to go over some of the response rate formulas and leave the others, but I'm happy to answer questions. It's important. AAPOR standards state that researchers should indicate specifically which outcome formula was used and make available any table showing the final disposition status for all your cases. When you're unsure which outcome rate formula to use, it's for your study, providing multiple outcome rates is a great option. And in studies that sample from multiple frames or multiple frames of the same type even, researchers should compute and report outcome rates separately for each frame. The outcome rates in the document and in the Excel calculator are based on 9 key quantities that we have now created because we have correctly dispositioned all of our cases according to our frame. We have 1.1s, which are complete interviews. They're categorized as I. We have Ps, those are our partial interviews. We have Rs, which are eligible refusals and breakoffs. So those are all of our 2.1 codes across the board. Our 2.1 codes come into the Rs. Our 2.2 codes are our non-contacts, so they get bucketed in our NCs, which you'll see in the formulas. And then we have others, so all of the other 2-point things show up in O. And then we have our 3s, right, our unknown eligibilities. So we have 3.1s are unknown if it's a household or an occupied unit. 3.2s are unknown about the actual eligibility of the person or people at the household. And then 3.9s are others. And our E is the estimated proportion of cases that are unknown that we're assuming are going to be eligible. So that will show up in the formulas that I'm going to show you. The E document is in the process of being updated to go along with this update to the standard definitions. But we should recognize that there are two, it should be clear from this discussion that there are 2 forms of eligibility, right? There's the housing unit eligibility or the phone number eligibility, and then the actual individual eligibility. And oftentimes it is important to sort of calculate those separately because you're going to have cases that are unknown in one way, but they're not unknown in the other. So having a rate to apply to all of your different unknown cases is super useful. Here's our 4 response rates, right? This is what you see. This is what you see reported when people say we're using AAPOR response rate 3. That's what these are. They're all basically the same, right? We have the numerator of your response rates are your completed interviews. So they're either just I or I plus P, right? If you've decided to include partials in your completes, you add the P to the numerator. If you have not, you don't. Response rate 1 and response rate 2 have the same denominator. It's literally all of your cases. Every case that was sampled except ineligibles, anything that's categorized as an ineligible goes out. They're not eligible. All eligible cases or unknown go into your denominator in response rate 1 and 2. Response rate 3 and 4 are essentially the same, but they take that E rate and they apply it to your unknown cases. There is some nuance here that I'll show you in the next slide, but basically the E rate says, okay, I'm going to assume 90%, because of all the cases I did reach, 90% were eligible, then I'm just going to assume that 90% are eligible among those we didn't reach. There are multiple ways of coming up with that E rate, and that is documented in the E document. So response rate 3 and 4, again, can be broken out, as I mentioned, into an E1 and an E2, right? If you want to separate out your eligible housing units from your eligible response rates, you can you can break it out and use E1 just when you're trying to estimate, you know the unit is eligible, but you don't know if the respondent is eligible. And then they both apply when you just don't know anything about the unit. I want to stop here instead of going through all of the other rates, because I really want to make sure that we have time for questions, also known as Stump the Standards chairs. So I'm going to turn it back over to Robin to moderate.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I learned a ton. It was great. So I'm going to pass it right to start with our questions. So there are a couple along the same lines that are about why are we including unused units in the denominator if you haven't made any effort to reach them? So like you talked about, even if it was a replicate that was released, but the cases were never attempted to be reached.
The main assumption there is that the replicates are selected through whatever random sampling mechanism you have used. So if you have just one sample, right, you've had some kind of, perhaps you have some kind of stratified sample, you can have a lot of different sampling, and you've sampled the replicate based on that assumption. So you know what the probability of selection is for all your cases in your replicate. You then release the replicate, and there's a lot of factors that go into how they get contacted and when they get contacted and when they get dialed. So the truth is that once your replicate is released, their probability of selection is in there, and they become unknown until some other disposition can be assigned. Okay. Because they're unknown, you're then going to apply that E rate to them. So say you've released 3 replicates and made some contact for all numbers in that replicate, and you've gotten like a 50% eligibility rate. You're going to apply that to your unknown cases in your replicate that you didn't dial, but you need to treat it like it was released sample.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. All right, so we have a lot of questions, so I'm going to go into another one. So somebody said polls don't release response rates, so why should I care about this when reporting results?
Polls don't release response rates. Polls should release response rates. Good polls do release response rates. I think it is important. It's important to understand in the same way that it's important to understand a margin of error in a poll. Mickey, do you have thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, the response rate is not the end all be all in determining whether there's significant non-response bias in your estimates, but it is, it enters into the formula for, the amount of non-response bias that there might be. So AAPOR standards treat it as kind of a minimal disclosure requirement for polls and other surveys that are AAPOR compliant. Not every polling organization is a member of AAPOR, but polls that follow the AAPOR standards should be reporting response rates.
Yeah, and there are many pollsters that are members of the AAPOR Transparency Initiative, and they are required to disclose response rates.
Okay, thank you. So, question for Mickey. I'm trying to squeeze them all in. How should records be classified in a listed sample when they're found to be ineligible, when all records should be eligible? And that is like when there was an error in making the sample file and they shouldn't have been on the list. So some of those records were called, and that's how they knew they were ineligible. But the rest had the same demographic in the file and they were deactivated and not called. So should some or all be included in the codes, or a note in the report made that they're not included in the total sample counts because they shouldn't have been included and they were ineligible?
Right. Yeah, this is a really good question, and might be an area where different people have different opinions. Be curious what Cameron thinks as well. Without knowing about the exact situation, in the situation as described, I think it would be appropriate to exclude them from the denominator. Like if you realize that there's an error in the list based on, and so you observe everybody with some observable characteristic from the list, I would leave them out of the denominator, but be sure to document that that decision was made and how your target population, how your frame was defined.
I would also say, right, there are cases when you're going to encounter one or two of your listed sample that are just wrong. But for the most part, you've assumed that your entire list is eligible. It's okay to categorize those cases as ineligible, but you're probably going to use a response rate formula that doesn't, you're not going to apply that eligibility to everybody else. You're going to treat everybody else as eligible non-respondents if they didn't respond.
Right. Okay. What do we do with multi-unit addresses where the address is valid, but the unit isn't specified and thus returned, or is somehow completed by some unit by chance of self-selection, not in the frame? Yeah. Like,
So
I don't know. I don't know if I said that quite right.
Address-based samples. So if you're talking about an address-based sample, which it sounds like you are, right? You have two types of multi-unit buildings on address-based samples. You have regular multi-unit buildings where you've got 123 Main Street, apartment 2, right? And what you have selected from your sample is literally 123 Main Street, apartment 2. If that shows up at apartment 3, it has not reached the right sample unit, right? You want to make sure, to the best of your ability, that it is being completed by the person at the address that you sampled, including the secondary address, right? Including that secondary apartment number or unit number. There are cases called drop points on the address-based sample, which are multi-unit buildings that have multiple residents, multiple households within the building that are not identified by specific unit numbers. They're most common in New York and Chicago. They add a little bit of complexity, and there's different ways to treat them. I don't know that it's worth getting into it now. They're a pretty small part of it. But feel free to reach out to me if you're dealing with drop points. Mickey and I have done a ton of work with drop points.
So I'm sorry to say that we are now at our 2 o'clock mark, and there are some additional questions. So I just really want to encourage everybody, please feel free to reach out to Cameron or Mickey,
please.
or to AAPOR. I'm sure they can. And thank you. Perfect. With your questions, there are great questions in here. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but really on behalf of the AAPOR Online Education Subcommittee, I just want to thank you both so much for your illuminating webinar, and more to come, I'm sure.
Awesome. Thank you, Robin. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Right. Bye-bye.